A little bit more detail about each of these key changes that we've made to the program. So the first, as I mentioned, is this concept of study management. And all the experimental data that you collect now must be part of what we call a study. So this is essentially a group of all the animals that are undergoing the exact same experimental protocol. And there are a number of different parameters, whether they're related to the animal itself or whether they're related to the sample, which can be tracked in the study. This is where the name LabBook sort of originates. This idea that we would be able to track the parameters and the experimental data that is typically jotted down in a laboratory notebook. I don't know that DMC would ever replace the laboratory notebook. I doubt it. But if we're able to have this data kept electronically and have a redundant copy that we know will be there and we know will be searchable, we feel that that is really a value add. So studies can be copied for future use, but may never be edited once created. And this is sort of to prevent inconsistencies in data recordings. Oftentimes, laboratories will have multiple users of the software. There may even be multiple students or technicians who are both working on the same study. And if we allowed editing of a study, then you certainly have the potential for inconsistencies in recordings and artifacts to occur. And we sort of felt that it would be in the best interest, given this new format, to not allow any editing. So the experimental protocols themselves, which we can create in a study or we can import, they can be reused. And you can sort of generate new ones on the fly. And that's where this sort of visual protocol window or this visual editor comes into play. Okay, at this point, we'll take a break from the slides here, and I'd like to sort of walk you through LabBook and show you some of these key functions in action and just how easy it is to use them and how quick it can be to set them up. I've just gone ahead and opened up the DMC LabBook software, and you can see that it pops up this little window here. And I'm going to go ahead and show you the Create Study window to start. But we don't have any previous study loaded, so we'll go ahead and basically design one from scratch. So I'm going to click on the Change Study here window. And as you can see, I have nothing created thus far. So let's go ahead and create a new study. So there's a number of parameters here and information that we have to populate into a new study, not the least of which is the name. So in the interest of creating something somewhat relevant, let's call this the MDX mouse trials, for instance, and we can say something like assessment of force in points. So that might be somewhat relevant to some of you watching this video. And now we're prompted to add some parameters about the animal that we want to track. So we could say something about the genotype. Well, we know that we're talking about the MDX genotype, so we'll leave that one off the list. But we may want to know if we have males and females, perhaps the sex of the animal. We probably will want to know the animal's mass. And We could say something about the age, what time point we're at, if there's a different treatment, we may want to capture this. We could type in our own parameters here and add them to the list if something in this drop-down list doesn't fit what you may want to track about the animal. I'll add date of birth as well. A little bit perhaps more rigorous than giving the age of the animal, especially if it's a non-terminal study. Notice that this ID parameter is always there by default. So we must give some sort of animal identifier, animal number as a bare minimum. And this is, of course, so we're able to later search for any data about the animal itself. So we've got a nice little list here. Let's now add some sort of parameters about the sample. And as some of you who are watching this video know, you have the ability to perform mechanics experiments on an isolated piece of muscle or tissue with our equipment, or you have the ability to do some in vivo experiments. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to assume that we're working on a piece of isolated muscle and not on an in vivo study, which would be the animal itself, in which case the sample parameters are somewhat redundant, considering that we've already collected a number of animal parameters. So if we have an isolated piece of tissue, we'll certainly want the mass, the dry mass of the muscle. We'll probably want the length at L0. And at a minimum, if we follow the standard formulas and conventions for known muscle types, we'll be able to use this to normalize any force that we record through the cross-sectional area calculation. We're now prompted to add any muscles that we want to include in this study. So that could be one up to a number of different animal or a number of different muscles from the animal. If the muscle that we seek to test is not in this list, this is sort of a list of the most common muscles that are used with our equipment, then as with the animal or sample parameters, we can sort of add our own. So if, for instance, we were doing an in vivo experiment, we might say we're testing the dorsiflexors, and I could add that now. We're going to assume we're looking at isolated tissue, so why don't we add some of these common muscles here? EDL, soleus, diaphragm strip, for instance. Finally, once we've decided what do we want to know about the animals in the study, what do we need to know about the samples in the study, and what muscles are we actually going to test, we come to perhaps the most important part of the study creation. And that is basically adding the experimental protocols to the study. We have them from a previous version. We can import them at this point by clicking on the import settings. Or we can simply click on the add experiment to study button, and this is going to take us to the visual experiment editor window.